Hey, folks, we're just going to give everyone a second to sign on. This is a very big meeting. We have about 300 people signed up to attend, and it is meeting format. So if you feel like having your camera on, that's fun. You know, obviously not a requirement, never a requirement, but always good to see you all. You know, and those of you who have been on these webinars before know that I use a script in the beginning and it sounds stilted and awful, but I got to do it because my memory is short. So I'm going to turn to that little intro script and do a little housekeeping, and then we'll get rolling. Okay. Do that now. So this part's not a script. Thanks to everyone here who's joined us. I hope that you're all on. Erin, let me ask you, do you think we have a pretty full house, or should I wait another minute?
You can go ahead and get started, I think.
Great. Welcome everyone to this very special Alliance conversation. Just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, if your organization happens not to be a member of Research America, I hope you'll shoot Joel, who is our director of membership, and whose email I believe is in the chat, a note, just to discuss our work and how much we value your involvement, which is so true. So I hope that you do that. And given the large number of participants, again, I think we have over 250 and probably nearly 300. We've got a couple of requests in terms of process. So we ask that you hold questions until the end of Erik's presentation. Jot them down, because we certainly don't want, there will probably be questions that arise during it, but let's wait till the end because of the number of questions we anticipate. And if you would, minimize questions in the chat, although use the chat, but when you want to ask questions, just raise your hand and we'll go, you know, kind of round robin and get to folks whose hands are raised and ask you to unmute and all that kind of thing. If you would keep questions to 30 seconds, you know, I don't know if less than 30 seconds is feasible, but if so, just so as many as people as possible can get a chance to ask their questions. Let me turn to the good stuff. We're joined today by Erik Fatemi. I bet a lot of you know Erik. He's the principal at Cornerstone Government Affairs. Among Erik's many distinctions, he served for 12 years on the Senate Labor Health and Human Services and Related Agencies Appropriations Subcommittee, including as a subcommittee staff director. And, you know, an unenviable job, but only certain people are like Erik are amazing enough to handle it. I'd love to continue singing Erik's praises, but in the interest of time, I'm going to ask Jacqueline to put Erik's bio in the chat. And with that, let me turn to you, Erik.
Great. Thank you so much, Allie. It's great to be with you today. Because look, who doesn't want to geek out on appropriations on this recess day? But no, that's why I love Research America, because of course you're here. Appropriations in August, bring it on. All right, let's try the most challenging part of the presentation, which is whether I will be able to share the screen. And just give me a second here. Okay, looks like we are in. So I will run through some slides for about 20 minutes or so, and then, as Ellie said, we'll open it up for questions. You know, looking at the registration list, I know that some of you are old hands at the appropriations process, and for others of you, it's pretty new. So we'll start with some basics, like appropriations 101 type level. But we'll also get into some appropriations 201 and who knows, maybe even some 300 level. Let's see if I can move my slides. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Here is some things that we'll cover to give you an idea. Some terms you should know. mandatory versus discretionary. What in the world is a CHIMP? Why should we care? Some numbers you should know, especially FY24 discretionary budget caps, 302B allocations. Why are they important? Why do they mean less than you might think? And throughout, we will look at NIH funding as a case study, since NIH is of interest to so many people who have joined today. You know, by the way, I will not offer predictions about what's going to happen this fall during the slide presentation, but I'll be happy to do that during the Q&A. Okay, everything that we'll discuss today about the appropriations process is derived from this one clause in the Constitution. And as a former Senate staffer, I'm obligated to note that it's in Article 1. The Constitution doesn't get around to talking about the president until Article 2. Just saying. This shows how important it was to the founding fathers that Congress has the power of the purse. And when we talk about appropriations, really we are almost always mean discretionary funding as opposed to mandatory. So what's the difference? A basic rule of thumb is that if Congress sets the funding level every year in an appropriations bill, it's discretionary. If the funding level is set outside of the appropriations process, it's mandatory. You know, a critical difference is that discretionary spending is subject to the annual discretionary budget caps, and mandatory spending is not. So entitlements like Social Security, those are good examples of mandatory programs. If people qualify for Social Security, they get their benefits. Appropriations bills don't have any control over that. All right, so that's the appropriations 101 on discretionary versus mandatory. Let's go to some appropriations 201. Not all mandatory spending is from entitlements. Sometimes Congress will decide that some programs ought to have guaranteed funding blocked off from the uncertain arrows of the appropriations process. And so the authorizing committees will pass laws that provide funding for these programs for a certain number of years with offsets that are in their jurisdiction. Now, to make things even more confusing, some programs are hybrids. They're a mix of mandatory funding and discretionary funding. So take a program that we all know, Pell Grants, the student aid program. If I were to ask you, should that be a discretionary program subject to the annual appropriations process, or should that be mandatory? Well, it's a trick question because according to Congress anyway, the answer is both. Some Pell Grant funding is mandatory. It comes from a law that was negotiated by the authorizing committees, the Senate Health Committee, the Ed and Labor Committee, and some of the funding is discretionary, which is set every year by the appropriators. All right, so NIH funding, almost entirely discretionary, except for a relatively tiny portion, 150 million, a lot of people don't even know it's there, in mandatory funding, and that is for type 1 diabetes. But everything else is discretionary. And this discretionary total of $49 billion approximately includes funding from the 21st Century Cures Act. And I'm going to dig into that law a little bit because it's especially relevant this year. So many of you will remember Congress passed the Cures Act in late 2016. And among other things, the law allocated almost $5 billion to NIH over 10 years for 4 specific things: precision medicine, cancer moonshot, brain initiative, and regenerative medicine. The law was written by authorizers outside of the appropriations process, and the goal was to supplement the money that NIH got every year in the Labor HHS bill. That kind of sounds like mandatory funding, right? In fact, sometimes people mistakenly refer to it as mandatory, but you know, this is a case where it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, but it's not a duck. It's discretionary, and it gets a little confusing. But what happens is the Cures Act sets funding aside for NIH in a special fund, but NIH can't spend it unless the Labor HHS bill unlocks the fund and appropriates it. And so that makes it discretionary. I know it's complicated, but the main point is this: NIH funding comes really from 2 sources. It's the regular base money that you get in the Labor HHS bill, and then some Cures Act funding. Picture it like this: the base funding for NIH, the non-Cures money, that's like your annual salary from your full-time job. The Cures money, that's your side hustle. It's extra. It's what you get from driving Uber on the weekends. You put them together, and that's your total income, or in this case, the total discretionary funding for NIH. But here's the thing about the CURES funding. It goes up and down from year to year. Some years, when the funding goes up, that's good. NIH gets a windfall. Other years, when the CURES funding goes down, that's bad. And in FY24, it's a real problem for NIH. So imagine the money from your side hustle will drop next year by more than half. So basically, people figured out you're a terrible Uber driver. Your rating is 1.1 stars, and you're probably not going to make much money next year driving for Uber. So that's what's happening in FY24. NIH got more than $1 billion from CURES in FY23, but the amount will drop by $678 million in FY24. The cancer moonshot funding, for example, that will dry up entirely. It'll go from 216 million to zero. So in a sense, NIH is going into FY24 $678 million in the hole. In other words, appropriators have to find $678 million from somewhere just to keep NIH level. So by the way, remember that number 678 million, because we're going to come back to it, and also that $216 million for the cancer moonshot, because we'll see that one again too. All right, let's now back up and look at discretionary spending overall. It's divided into 12 appropriations bills. We pay the most attention to Labor HHS, the bill I used to work on, because it includes NIH, CDC, HRSA, so forth. And here are the relative sizes of those bills. Note that more than half of all discretionary spending goes to defense. And Labor H, on the left there, is the largest of the non-defense bills. And this pie chart here leads us to two jargony terms that you need to know. And they are the 302A and the 302Bs. So, think of how big is that entire pie that we were just looking at? That's the 302A. The 302Bs, those are the allocations for each subcommittee bill. So they are the slices of the pie. 302A, entire pie, 302B, the slices. So who determines the 302A and the 302Bs? Well, in theory, as you can see from the slide, the budget committees set the 302A, and that's what used to happen like 15, 20 years ago, but not so much anymore. These days, the overall cap usually gets negotiated at a really high level, House and Senate leadership in the White House. And this year is a perfect example. So the budget caps for FY24, and effectively the 302A, that was set in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the debt ceiling deal. The budget committees had nothing to do with it. And in fact, the budget committees today are almost irrelevant to the appropriations process. The 302Bs, meanwhile, are set by the chairs of the appropriations committees. So the chair of Senate Appropes, Patty Murray, she sets the Senate 302Bs, and the chair of House Appropes, Kate Granger, sets the House 302Bs. And the levels can be wildly different. So let's take a look at Labor HHS. So the Senate allocation for FY24 is $45 billion higher than the House's allocation. That's obviously a huge difference. I mean, for $45 billion, you could fund almost all of NIH. Now, eventually, in conference, they'll have to work out compromise 302Bs for each subcommittee, because only then, when you know how much money you're working with, can the staff and members get serious about negotiating the bills. But that's going to be quite a challenge this year, because the House and Senate are starting on really different planets. But now here's something curious about 302Bs. And now we're definitely getting into Appropriations 201, but let's give it a try. So we just learned that the Senate 302B allocations, for Labor H in the Senate is $195.2 billion. Well, the Senate Appropriations Committee approved the Labor HHS bill last month, July 27th, by a remarkable bipartisan vote of 26-2. And the first sentence of the committee summary of the bill says the total funding is $224.4 billion. Well, what's going on here? how can the total funding for the bill be that much higher than the allocation? Well, here's the answer. And the allocations are important, but they don't tell the whole story. Many of the bills, especially Labor HHS, include funding from other sources on top of the allocation, and it can be a lot of funding. In the Senate bill, it's almost $30 billion. That's why, honestly, I don't get really worked up about the 302Bs when I hear them. The appropriations committees mark them up, approve them publicly at the first full committee markup. These levels get reported in CQ and Bloomberg and Axios and Science and so forth, and they should. But the impression everyone gets is that's all the money that's available for those bills. What's not public until you actually see the text of the bills is how much extra will get added on top of the allocations. So whenever the allocations are released, I use them to get a general sense of where each committee is thinking. For example, which subcommittee allocations go up from the previous years, which ones go down. But I don't look at the allocations and say, now I know exactly how much the bills will get this year. You don't know that. You don't know that until you see the bills and you look at all the extras, okay? And in the Labor HHS bill, those extras come in 4 categories listed here: emergency funding, cap adjustments, rescissions, and everyone's favorite acronym, CHIMPs. So let's walk through an example of each category in the Senate Labor HHS bill. So first is emergency funding. Appropriators love emergency funding because it's not subject to the budget caps. And here's one example at the National Cancer Institute. Remember how I said that the cancer moonshot funding will drop from $216 million in FY23 to 0 in FY24. The Senate bill replaces that moonshot funding with $216 million in emergency funding. In fact, as we'll talk about later, the bill replaces all $678 million of the CURES shortfall with emergency funding. So, let's be honest here. This is a creative use of emergency funding. This is not an emergency, like floods in Vermont or fires in Maui, but this is a good example of what appropriators do. They look for money wherever they can find it. Next are rescissions. So rescissions repeal funding that was enacted in previous years, but hasn't been spent yet. And so here's one example. The bill rescinds $850 million in unspent COVID funding. This language makes that money available for appropriators to spend on other Labor HHS programs. The third is cap adjustments. Sometimes Congress will allow appropriations bills to exceed the budget caps if they use that money for a designated purpose that everyone agrees is a good cause, like rooting out healthcare fraud and abuse. So in this case, the cap gets to go up by $604 million, but all of that money has to be used to fight fraud. Okay, now we come to the famous CHIMPs. And everyone loves that acronym. Even better is that the largest of the CHIMPs is the CHIP. And it's a biggie. It's $19 billion. So this is $19 billion that is not that is at the disposal of the Labor H bill that is not part of the 302B allocation. So the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, it's a mandatory program that provides money for a contingency fund that states can draw down from under certain conditions. They can use that money for providing children's health insurance. Well, the fact is that if money is left over, and there's always money left over every year, Congress can rescind that money and apply it to discretionary appropriations. And no children are harmed in this. This is not money that is taken away from kids. It's money that is not being used for this. And so in Washington world, that counts as a savings. And so you get what's called a change in mandatory program, or a CHIMP. So let me pause for a second and say, I realize that some of this is pretty technical. If you're not following every detail, don't worry about it. The takeaway is that appropriators are looking for every dollar they can, using every possible legal means, rescissions, emergencies, CHIMPs, you name it. It's their job to be creative, and these are some of the ways that they are creative. So now let's switch gears again and review the budget caps for FY24. Under the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the debt ceiling deal, defense gets a $28 billion increase. That's about 3%. Non-defense, after you factor in $69 billion in what's being described as side deals, it's virtually flat. A cut of $1 billion. Now, I'm not going to go into the side deals here, but if people want me to talk about it later, I'm happy to do that. In addition to setting the budget caps, the debt ceiling deal does something really important, and it gives Congress a deadline of April 30, 2024 to pass all 12 appropriations bills. And if Congress misses that deadline, if it chooses instead to do year-long CRs, every discretionary account in every bill, defense and non-defense, will face a 1% across the board cut. That's quite a stick. And it is a big reason why I'm bullish that Congress will, despite all odds, pass all 12 bills as opposed to a year-long CR. Now, there's been some confusion about the deadline. Some reports have said it's January 1. In fact, I've read quotes from members of the appropriations committees who said the deadline is January 1. The real deadline is April 30. And again, I can go into that more in the Q&A if people are interested, but the deadline is April 30. But guess what? No one is happy with the budget caps, but for completely different reasons. House Republicans say the non-defense cap is way too high. In their view, just because it's ceiling doesn't mean they have to reach it. And so Chairwoman Granger said non-defense allocations that come in $119 billion, below the non-defense cap, back to the FY22 levels. Completely different situation in the Senate, where both Democrats and Republicans think the caps don't go high enough. In fact, Chair Murray and Vice Chair Collins agreed to give the bills an additional $14 billion in emergency funding above what's allowed in the debt ceiling deal. So you have the House and Senate that are both, they're trying to go in different directions on the budget caps. You remember back in June when President Biden signed the debt ceiling deal, people hoped the overall spending levels for FY24 were settled. Thank goodness. We don't have to argue about that anymore this year. Well, that lasted about 5 minutes. This is going to be a major fight that continues through the rest of this calendar year. All right, now let's drill down on NIH again. So given that the House and Senate are on such different planets when it comes to overall caps, it's no surprise that NIH fares worse in the House Labor H bill than it does in the Senate. So the House bill, when you factor in RPAH, which would take a $1 billion cut, the House bill would cut NIH by $3.8 billion. The Senate bill would increase funding for NIH by $265 million. So that's a swing of about $4 billion between the two bills. But all right, let's pause for a second on that $265 million increase in the Senate bill. Because wait a second, $265 million, are you sure that's not what it said in the Senate summary of the bill? The summary said the increase was $934 million, and that's what all the news reports said too. Okay, so for our final exam, what's going on here? The Senate Appropriations Committee summary and practically every news story about the bill said the FY24 increase for NIH is $934 million. Why is $265 million a more meaningful number? And no, you cannot use ChatGPT for this. All right, here we go with the answer. This is absolutely appropriations 301 level, but let's give it a try. So remember that the Cures Act funding drops by $678 million in FY24. The Senate bill replaces that money, that shortfall, with $678 in emergency. So that's a wash. It's up $678 in emergency, down $678 in cures. That's a wash at zero. Otherwise, setting that aside, the bill increases NIH funding by $265 million. So why did the Senate summary say the increase is $934 million? So here's how they did it. They took that, what I'll call true increase for NIH of 265 million. They added the emergency funding increase, 678, and that's where you get the 934. But honestly, that's a little bit of spin. It's not quite apples to apples because it's ignoring the $678 million reduction in cures. So that's why I think most people would say that the 265 million is a better number, a truer increase, reflection of what's happening in the Senate bill. But look, it's some spin. I don't want to beat them up too much about that. I'll be honest. If I was working there, I might have done the same thing. And as I said, the Senate bill is still $4 billion better than the House. So let's give them some credit for that. If you were able to follow that explanation, congratulations, you get an A+. And if you didn't, well, I would say blame the professor. Maybe he needs to rethink his career and spend some more time driving for Uber. Let me stop there and let's get into some questions. I've got my magic 8-ball here, and so I am ready to.
You can tell I've unmuted. Could we go back to, I don't know if anyone else is seeing it, but I always forget what a gallery setting so we can all see each other.
Yeah, let me see if I can stop sharing.
Okay. Yay. Okay, beautiful. I'm just going to ask, since I know I'm assuming that other folks are raising their hands. Please do if you have questions. I'm going to ask one, and if we don't have others, I have others' hands raised. I have a million. Could we go to the side deals? And here's my question. When you talked about CHIMPs, and I think you should say CHIMPs 3 times fast just for all of us, but when you talked about CHIMPs plus emergency plus rescissions, right? Were you talking about the side deal?
Yeah. So there were some, there are CHIMPs, there are emergencies, there are rescissions every year.
Yes.
What happens in the side deals? Those side deals is that they agreed, all 4 corners agreed that those CHIMPs and the emergencies and rescissions could go up in FY24. And that's basically where you get that additional money in the side deals. That's 69 billion. It came from essentially handshake agreements between the 4 corners to allow more for those categories. So that's what the side deals are.
That makes so much sense.
Okay.
So I see that we have hands raised. At least Donna's hand is raised, and I think Sam's going to join us to broker this. I actually am right now seeing Eric, you spotlighted, so I can't see the whole gallery. I don't know how others are seeing the image.
I see the whole gallery.
You're seeing the whole gallery?
I am.
So it's my own doing with my video settings. Sam, can you join us and broker questions that we're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Eric. This has been great so far. So it looks like we have Donna and then Jennifer have their hands raised. So go ahead, Donna.
Good afternoon. I was about to say good morning. How's everyone doing? So Eric, I have 2 quick questions. Will there be a shutdown? And do you think we'll ever, I know we worked during the first sequestration on trying to get parity between defense and non-defense. Do you think that will ever happen?
Let me take the first one, and maybe I'll expand on that and make it not a short answer, but a longer answer, which I will talk about the shutdown, but and this might address other people's questions, but what I think will happen in the end game. What is ultimately going to happen with these bills? So, and remember, I am just one former appropriations staffer, albeit with a magic 8-ball, but and so people I respect will disagree with me, but here goes. I'm pessimistic about the short term in terms of a government shutdown. I think you can count on a government shutdown, and it might last a while. But I am optimistic about the long term. I believe that Congress will pass all 12 appropriations bills, and I think the Labor H bill will include at least a modest increase for NIH. Now, I should hasten to add that's not going to happen on its own. It's going to take a strong advocacy effort from everyone on this call and all your friends who care about NIH and other important federal programs. But I'm optimistic that Congress will ultimately pass all 12 bills. And I'll say, let me go into that. First, every year, people bet against the appropriations process, and every year they lose. We haven't had a year-long CR since 2013. And, that is, despite everyone, lots of headwinds, people say, oh, there's no way they'll get the appropriations bills done this year. Every year, at least since 2013, appropriators managed to find a way to pass the bills. No doubt, this year is a special challenge. A faction in the House, the Freedom Caucus, doesn't want appropriations bills, or at least at any level that anyone, the vast majority of the world thinks is reasonable. And they have enormous leverage over Speaker McCarthy, who very much wants to remain Speaker McCarthy. So that is a problem, no doubt. But there are also unusual factors this year that work in favor of completing the bills. And so, we often talk about the four corners in Congress: House Democrats, House Republicans, Senate Democrats, Senate Republicans. Let's go through this. The two Democratic corners, they always want funding bills. That's what makes them Democrats. Democrats, the government exists to solve problems. And what better way to solve problems than spend money, right? Okay, I'm a Democrat. Well, that's true, we all know. But Senate Republicans also really want the bills. And let me see if I can, let me try to share my screen again. And see if I can, okay. So let's see if I can get this guy. All right, here. Yeah. Okay. So again, Senate Republicans also really want the bills. And I remind people, the Senate Appropriations Committee just approved all 12 bills, and every one of them passed unanimously or almost unanimously. That just doesn't happen very often. That's extraordinary, especially for a bill like Labor HHS, which is mostly, honestly, it's a Democratic bill, but still it got 26-2. Now, a big reason why Senate Republicans want all 12 bills to pass is that it's the only way to get more money for defense. So let's remind you of this slide here. Under the debt limit deal, defense is slated to get a $28 billion increase. That doesn't happen not only if they don't pass defense, if none of the bills, if any of the bills don't pass, defense doesn't get that increase. All 12 have to pass. So then also, though, remember that what's the alternative to all 12 bills passing? That means that there would be a 1% cut against defense and non-defense. But the pain of that would be especially tough on defense. Because think about it, defense would go down by 1%, but it would also not lose the 3% it's slated to get. So that's a 4% effective cut. And that is, way in a total opposite direction of where Republicans want to go on defense this year. So for that reason, I'm happy. I'm optimistic. I'm not optimistic that Senate Republicans are really going to push this. So 3 of the 4 corners want bills. The only one that doesn't is House Republicans, but I think eventually they'll come around. And as I said before, the Freedom Caucus has outsized leverage, but the caucus as a whole is divided. A lot of House Republicans want these bills to pass too. If the shutdown lasts a while, as it very well might, the members of the Freedom Caucus, honestly, they're not going to care, and their constituents aren't going to care. but the party will care, because eventually this will reflect poorly on the Republican Party, and they'll start to notice. And eventually, I think we'll see a coalition come together, like the one that passed the debt ceiling deal. You know, the far right will oppose it, so will the far left, but most Democrats will vote for these bills, and I think a lot of Republicans will too. So let me stop there.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. And I think Jennifer, you had your hand up next.
I did. I was going to ask first, Eric, thanks so much for this. It was super fun to hear you talk about all of this great appropriation stuff. And I especially appreciate your confession that if you were writing the bill, you would have talked about the $900+ million increase. So I was going to ask about your predictions. I appreciate that you already offered those. Maybe I'll phrase it even more broadly. What are your predictions for NIH funding over the next 5 years? Do you see us being in sort of a drought state similar to post doubling, or do you have a more optimistic view of where we might go?
Yeah. So again, I think that NIH will do okay this year. It'll be interesting. You know, now that people are starting to get that the increase in the Senate bill really is 265, not 934. That doesn't look as good as 934. And I think that as more people sort of start to realize that, and honestly, Republicans start to get, clued in more on that number, there's a chance that could even go up in FY24 above the Senate level, because, we'll see. I do think that whatever happens this year will have a lot of bearing and be a very good predictor of what happens next year. If things crater this year and we don't get bills, that doesn't bode well for next year, right? If we get bills this year and effectively, we find a way to break the backs of the Freedom Caucus, then I think that we will get bills again next year. And again, I think NIH will do okay, better again. It's important to also note, better than practically everybody else. When you think of the world of non-defense discretionary, NIH is going to continue to do better than everybody else. But it's still all going to be relative, because we're living under the terms of the debt limit deal, which is very fiscally constrained. Honestly, when you go beyond that year, we're really looking after the presidential election, after the congressional, every race in the House. You'd really have to go to this guy to say what is in the long term. I do think there's been a lot of speculation about what Congress thinks about NIH overall. Has the halo, been dusted up a little bit? It's still, very strong. The support in Congress is still very strong, despite what maybe some dings has taken over COVID and gain of function and things like that. I mean, anyone who watched the Senate Labor HHS hearing on NIH, I mean, it was an absolute love fest. And even among Republicans, it was not, why are we doing this in NIH and, that, and it was, hey, NIH representative standing in front of here, how do you defend the president's budget that didn't give more to Alzheimer's or more to this or more to that? It was all about how can we, we do more. So I think that the support for Congress, from Congress for NIH is still strong, and I'm hopeful that that will carry forward, even into the out years beyond the 2024 election.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric, and thank you, Jennifer. So I don't see any more hands raised in the participants right now. So I'll remind everyone, please, raise your hand and join the conversation. But we do have a question in the chat about the April 30th deadline. Can you go into a little bit more detail about why the true deadline is April 30th versus the end of the year like it's being reported?
Yeah, and that's super confusing. And the reason it's confusing is that the bill lists both dates as deadlines. There's a January 1 deadline and an April 30 deadline. And so first, the bill says that if Congress doesn't pass all 12 appropriations bills by January 1, then the defense and non-defense caps each drop by 1%. And that's why everyone is saying the deadline is January 1. But in the next paragraph, the bill goes on to say that if Congress passes the bills by April 30, then never mind, no sequestration. So here's the upshot. If Congress doesn't pass the bills by January 1, then OMB has to start preparing for sequestration. But Congress has another 4 months before sequestration would go into effect. So if, let's say they missed the January 1 deadline, but they pass all 12 bills by January 2 or February 19 or April 29, then no sequestration. So we should hope it doesn't come to this. It's better, we would all want Congress to pass the bills as quickly as possible by January 1, but if they miss January 1, April 30 is the real deadline.
Perfect.
Thank you. All right, Bruce has his hand raised.
Eric, great presentation. 2 questions. One, do you have any thoughts on how RPAH is being socialized within NIH, and how it's being received, a year in, and is it being seen as complementary? How do you think that the powers that be at the NIH are accommodating itself to this new reality? And secondly, even though not an appropriations question, do you have any thoughts on how this impasse on the director's nomination will be resolved? And do you think is there a possibility that Republicans can help get the nominee confirmed? And if so, how do you do it over the objections of the chair?
So first of all, Bruce, great to hear your voice again. On RPAH, this is obviously I'm not, everything I hear is secondhand, but I would say that I think all the signs are as positive as they can be at this point. Everyone who is involved, RPAH and NIH, they are all saying the right things about staying in touch, and talking to each other about this is what we're doing, this is what understanding what you're doing, and so I think they're all saying the right things. It is early. RPAH, I think, actually just made its first award, yesterday or something like that, in the cancer space. So it's a little early to know exactly how everything is playing out. But I'm hopeful that people are saying, are going to be sincere about staying in touch and not trying to duplicate, not trying to hurt each other's turf, but to really, view these things as complementary. On the
Eric, if you had to bet, where will it be located geographically?
Oh, Bruce.
Well, I mean, I think it's looking like there's going to be these 3 locations, and I have no idea where the other ones are, but I think a lot of the core is going to be somewhere in the, the DC area, and then there's going to be a couple of other locations, and I have no idea, absolutely no idea where these other locations are going to end up. So then prospects for the NIH director, I have heard that maybe some things they're making some progress on that, and I am hopeful that this logjam can finally be broken. It is ironic though, right, that Bruce, that the objections have not come on the Republican side. the challenges have been on the Democratic side with Senator Sanders and Senator Warren, but I'm hearing some rumblings that we're making some progress there. And look, I think we'd all agree, the sooner the better. And this is nothing against Dr. Tabak, who's done a fantastic job in his capacity, but I think it's good for any $49 billion agency to have someone as a permanent director, and also the sooner the better too, because I mean, remember the director serves at the pleasure of the president, and President Biden is guaranteed to be president only so much longer, about a year and a half or so at this point. So I think the sooner the better, but I am hopeful that if they can resolve these issues, that she can get get her confirmation, go through Congress relatively quickly, and we can get her on board.
Sam, I'm going to ask a quick question, Erik, and I'm so sorry if I missed this in answer to Jen's question. I was trying to come up with Star Wars puns for our chat. I don't know if anyone's been following the Star Wars theme. Erik, did you cover the question of conferencing a bill that hasn't come out of subcommittee on the House side, the Labor H bill?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the House, of course, has not marked up Labor HHS in full committee. We've done it in subcommittee. We've seen the bill text. We have not publicly, anyway. There are some bootleg copies flying around of what is in the report. And so let me back up a little bit. So unfortunately, we almost never have a situation where you take a bill that has been passed by the House, a Labor H bill that has been passed by the House, and a Labor H bill that has been passed by the Senate, and these both bills that have been passed on each floor go to conference. It's almost never like that. Remember last year, we had a flip of the situation where the Senate did not mark, the Senate Appropriations Committee didn't mark up Labor HHS. The House subcommittee did, the Senate did not. And what ended up happening was on the Senate side, the chair of Labor H, Senator Murray at the time, she released text, but it did not go, it was not text that had any official standing. It had not gone through the Senate Appropriations. Well, this looks like it's going to be the reverse this year, where the Senate has marked up its bill by, again, this vote of 26-2. I'm going to come back to that. And the House has not, and honestly, probably will not. It probably will not get to that. And so that's not necessarily, that's not always a huge problem, for better or for worse, that one House hasn't marked up. They get in the room, all four corners get in the room, and all four corners, play a role. And it's not the death knell of, for the House that they haven't done, in this case, that they haven't passed a bill through committee. This year, though, is a little different. And that is because the Senate bill, I'm keep coming back to this,
Bipartisan.
was overwhelmingly bipartisan. Again, that just doesn't happen that often. I mean, we have 26-2. I don't know if there's some talk that the Senate is going to try to move some bills on the floor in September. I don't know if Labor H would be one of those, but even if it doesn't pass the floor, remember that practically anything in the Senate to get done, it needs 60 votes. Well, you basically have the 60 votes. If every Democrat votes for the Labor HHS bill, as they will, and every Republican on the Senate Appropriations Committee votes for the Labor HHS bill, who voted for the bill already in committee, you got more than 60. And if I'm a Senate negotiator, I am absolutely using that as leverage in the conference negotiations.
Yeah.
Look, you guys, the House, you couldn't even get a bill through committee. Look at what we did in the Senate. And I would say more nicely than that, but that's what I would say is like, look, talk to us when you can even get a bill through committee. You can't. Look at what we've done. This is, we have basically proven that we can draft a bipartisan bill. And so I do think that this year in particular, it does matter that the House will not get this bill through committee.
Let me ask you, I'm so sorry, go ahead.
I'll make one broader.
No, absolutely, go ahead.
Yeah, and just to come back on that, again, this is early, got a long way to go. My guess is that the final bills that are enacted at the end of the year, that they look a lot like the Senate bills. I think they probably will. Obviously there's going to be give and takes. 100%, though, it's not going to be identical to the Senate bills. But the Senate bills, because they've been so bipartisan, almost unanimous in many cases, I think we should look at those final bills as being close to what ends up as the final products.
Along those lines, Eric, one more quick question. So there are those particularly, as you can imagine, certain constituencies within Research America, and we are a Lift All Boats alliance, but it is pretty striking that the House would cut NIAID by nearly a quarter, by 23%. Is there a precedent or scenario in which NIH dollars get shuffled around in order to appease those in the House that would cut NIAID? I think it's, no, I don't think there's been a public reason, but I think that it appears that it has to do with anger and those kind of things.
I do not expect that cut to make it through Congress. I don't think I'd be shocked. I really don't. I think that's more of a anger kind of messaging type of thing, but I would be shocked if that survives till the end.
I think that's wonderful, and I do think that doesn't mean that if there's silence, it's golden. So I think that advocacy for NIH and for NIAID and for every institute and agency and for CDC and the others, as Eric said before, if you are silent, you get what you don't talk about. And
That's
so
a great point, and that is really true. Look, when either the House or Senate, when they cut things, if they don't hear any blowback, then it's like, well, I didn't feel any pain from that. People must not care. So you all need to show you care.
I see David Bowen has turned on his camera. Does that mean that he's going to impart wisdom?
No, certainly not. I was just going to ask a question of Eric, and sorry for the background noise. Are you still betting on a shutdown in the short term?
Yes, David, I am. I think it, as I said a little earlier, I do think that there will be a shutdown. And honestly, I almost feel like that it has to happen. Like it's almost as part of the process, even for like the House Freedom Caucus to vent for McCarthy to let it happen, to show that at least that he's trying to carry the water of the Freedom Caucus. I think that it's almost like, this anger has to be let out some way. And so I think it could last a little while. But I do think that eventually, the other, the majority of Congress that wants to see bills will ultimately prevail.
How do you claw your way out in this kind of environment from a shutdown?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and I don't. My guess is that usually the party that is identified with causing the shutdown
Finds a
ends up
path.
paying a political price. And as I said before, the individual members of the House Freedom Caucus, they probably don't care. And as I said before, their constituents probably don't care. They probably are hearing from their constituents, federal government is not doing anything anyway. Who cares if it's shut down, right? But that is not the case in a lot of the country, as including Republican districts. And again, as I said, there are a lot of Republicans who want these bills to pass. I think ultimately the pressure builds. It may, the SUP money, the SUP is the supplemental, the request. That's really complicated. I don't know how that's going to play out, but because there's a lot of things in these SUP requests, there's stuff that everybody probably wants to do in terms of disaster. There's stuff that Republicans are split on, Ukraine. But it's possible that some of the pressure from the SUP, especially with emergency stuff, might help be a driver for ultimately coming to, breaking the logjam. I don't know. But I do think ultimately that, they're going to find a way. Ultimately, Speaker McCarthy is going to have to, bite the bullet and explain, to the Freedom Caucus, look, here's where we are. And it's going to be painful, but I do think they'll get there.
So Eric, do you have time for one more question? I see Mark Johnson in the chat is interested. I think he's talking about quote unquote earmarks. Mark, is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Can you explain how community project funding falls into the appropriations process?
Yes. So if I'm not sure the exact question, but I can say a couple things about it. If not all 12 bills are passed, there's no earmarks. So that really is an incentive for passing these bills, because there will still be a lot of money in earmarks. That will not happen unless they get all 12 bills passed. Now, we do have a weird situation this year where there are no earmarks at all from the House in Labor H. And that is a big frustration to House members in general, but especially House Labor HHS members. I don't think that's going to be a deal breaker in and of itself on Labor HHS. I mean, House members were able to get more money proportionally than in other bills. But that is a good point, that yes, earmarks potentially for some members will be an incentive to pass the bills, because they will not happen if they're year-long CRs.
Wow, it's interesting that it's not in the House. I know we have 2 minutes. Super quick question from the chat, and that is, I think it's super quick. Beyond the 1% penalty, not penalty, excuse me. My understanding, Eric, I'm the one who answered this, so I hope I was right, is in fiscal year 25, the cap allows for a 1% increase.
Yes.
Only for defense and non-defense. I think the question is, if Congress doesn't pass appropriations by end of fiscal year 24, does anything else get triggered that bleeds into 25, or else is anything else negative associated with that failure to pass bills?
I don't think so. I think it is that 1% sequestration, but I don't think that bleeds into FY25. I could be wrong about that. Here's something, I will betray myself. I'm your typical, former appropriations staffer. We think 1 year at a time. I mean,
I get it. You couldn't think more.
I am like,
yeah,
eye on the ball, FY24. Can we get FY24 done and then deal with FY25 next year?
That's right. But if there is a sequestration, that becomes the quote unquote baseline. Of course, appropriators can do whatever they want.
I apologize. I'm not positive. There are probably people on this call who can answer that. But
well, it's the baseline is what the appropriators want to be.
I hear what you're saying. It's a good question. I should know the answer.
Is Adrian Hallett No, it's 1 o'clock, Eric, and
He knows. Go ahead.
you've just been super generous with your time, and this has been a really outstanding meeting. And thanks to everyone for joining us. If you have one more second, we'll talk about our next Alliance meeting, which actually is tomorrow and is going to be super cool. So Jacqueline, if you could join us.
Sure. Thanks, Allie and Eric, for this really informative discussion and a really great refresher on all things appropriations. The Uber metaphors are very helpful. Thanks as well to our audience for tuning in and participating. So if there's a link in the chat now, we hope you can join us tomorrow, August 24th at noon Eastern for our next Alliance discussion. We'll have a conversation with Dan Farmer. He's the principal on health and life sciences practice at BGR Government Affairs. And we've asked Dan to shed light on pending changes in Medicare decision-making around breakthrough medical devices and the implications for patients and research inside and outside the medical device sector.
And I'll just say to all here, this is really precedent setting. It's HHS trying to respond to the speed of FDA approvals when they speed up the regulatory pathway, CMS trying and working on speeding up the coverage pathway. So it's meaningful for every single patient and for the community as a whole. That's my pitch here. It's a pretty big deal. Sorry, Jacqueline, I always
No
do
worries.
jump in.
I was at the end. So thanks everyone for joining us today. We look forward
Thanks
to seeing you
everyone.
soon. Have a great afternoon.